welcome to Campus Connect. We are having crucial conversations for critical moments. I'm Nozipho Shabalala, and we're in conversation with Africa's leading academics, business professionals, as well as thought leaders, and we're tapping them for insights to build and to surface tools to help us navigate these crisis moments. Today, we have a true global player who holds many titles, but for the purposes of this conversation, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce the Chairman Emeritus of the International Integrated Council, as well as Professor of Wits Business School, and a corporate governance leader around the world that really needs no introduction. Professor Mervyn King is joining us in this conversation. And the crucial question that he's going to help us unpack and to explore is how boards may lead more effectively in times of crisis and beyond. Professor King, welcome to Campus Connect, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. In order to answer that question, I'd just like to give a bit of background.
Absolutely.
And that is that during the 20th century, we had a century of unsustainable development, because the corporate regime was believed to be that the boards should act in the best interest of the shareholder. We had the doctrine of the primacy of the shareholder. So by 1997, with expedited research from the third industrial revolution, namely the computer age, we in the academic and business worlds were able to see that the makeup of the market capitalization of great companies on great stock exchanges, only about 20% of that was made up of additives in a balance sheet, according to financial reporting standards. The rest became known as the non-financial assets, and unfortunately, because they all have financial outcomes. And today they are rather referred to as those within the ESG cluster, environmental, social, and governance cluster. So what happened as the turn into the 21st century is that it was realized and accepted by the International Federation of Accountants that a board could not discharge its duty of accountability by just doing an annual financial statement according to financial reporting standards. So sustainability reporting was born, and I became the chairman of the Global Reporting Initiative, which is still the gold standard. And I was at the same time chairman of the United Nations on Governance and Oversight. So I became very aware of the sustainability issues in the world. And consequently, in King 3, as it became known, we recommended integrated thinking and integrated reporting. What is integrated thinking? It is that to think and develop the business model of the company and its strategic direction on the basis that companies actually operate not in silos, but that the financial capital, manufacturing capital, human capital, intellectual capital, natural assets, social, including the relationship with stakeholders, are integrated 24/7. They're not separated. So integrated thinking started evolving. Now, before the virus hit our shores in South Africa, we already had our economic problems. Our economy was already on its knees. And then arrived the coronavirus. And so we have two crises in South Africa. We have a crisis of our economy and a crisis of this virus. And so some weeks ago, I coined the word coronanomics to put the two together. And our companies and organizations, such as Wits University, is actually operating in this sea of coronanomics. And it's a sea creating fear and panic. So boards have started thinking, and the revolutionary immensity of an integrated report is in the thinking, not in the report itself. And as I've tried to indicate to you by this background, boards are now thinking on this integrated basis because it's appreciated we're in a resource-constrained world, and yet we have increasing population. So companies have to produce more product, but with a lesser natural asset base, which is a sustainability issue. So during this period of coronanomics, a board has to absolutely adopt the principles of integrated thinking, putting all this together. They have to, as it is said in the integrated reporting framework of the International Integrated Reporting Council, that boards have to learn and understand the needs, interests, and expectations of the various stakeholder groupings pertinent to the business of that company. And only when you understand that can you then start making a decision in the best long-term interest of the health of the company. So the thinking, the mindset's moved from increasing the wealth of shareholders to the health of the company.
So Prof, let me jump in there just for a second. I think you've shared some already really powerful nuggets in just that opening. And you've landed on this idea that there's a mindset shift that's going to be required given the realities of the period that we find ourselves in. Maybe let's just unpack that a little bit. What is the traditional thinking of directors, executive or non-executive, that we are used to on board? And what is it that is at the core of this mindset shift that you are calling on for boards to really be able to lead companies, not just from surviving the coronavirus crisis, but potentially also thriving in a post-lockdown environment?
Well, before coronanomics, directors had already changed their mindset to shift from profit virtually at any cost, and it was profit subsidized by society and the environment, to value creation in a sustainable manner because of our resource constraints. So that's already in place at the start of coronanomics. But now what boards have to do is think not only on an integrated basis, but we have the Sustainable Development Goals. And Sustainable Development Goal 17 is the critical one in this period of coronanomics, namely cooperation and collaboration. We've seen the pandemic has driven collaboration around the world on finding a vaccine, for example. So that the crisis, you shouldn't lose the opportunities arising out of a crisis. And the opportunity arising out of this crisis is greater collaboration between the company and its stakeholders. Why? Because it's realized there have to be compromises. So not only does a board have to understand the needs, interests, and expectations of its stakeholders, but also their hardships, the tribulations they're suffering and will suffer under this coronanomic nightmare. And so let's assume we come out of it in 18 months' time. The critical issue during this 18 months is survival. Because if a company doesn't survive now and goes into liquidation, its infrastructure will be sold in a market which is not there, so it's knocked down prices. Human capital will be dispersed. And when the economy turns again, let's say in 18 months or 2 years' time, if you can have a nucleus of a company left, it's better to resurrect that with a resurrecting economy rather than the company disappearing altogether. So the critical issue is a mindset shift to integrated, collaborative, compromising mindset. The company has to compromise with its stakeholders. The stakeholders have to compromise inter se and then compromise with the company. So you need this element of concern, of collegial common sense approach, that this is an economy we're all suffering hardships. And it's maybe management has to drop by 50%. Workers have to drop by 50%. Suppliers have to supply more cheaply. Service providers have to work more cheaply, whatever it is. But we've got to try and get companies surviving. So we keep the nucleus to rebuild. When we move from survive to thrive mode, we have that nucleus to work with. Otherwise, it disappears.
So, Prof, my intervention there, I think, was leading us to the point around conscious corporate leadership? Because this is what I know you've been very passionate about in your capacity at the as patron in the Good Governance Academy. But essentially what I'm hearing you say is that if we begin to widen the scope of what the directors are looking at in terms of servicing not just the shareholders, but looking at the full community of stakeholders, the conversation begins to change. You've also mentioned something else that I'll get back to a little bit later, this idea of value creation. And I want to bring that up a little bit later because I know that you've been really active in pushing this idea for chief value officers instead of chief financial officers. But let's come to the conscious corporate leader that you are saying is potentially the leader that we're going to need now and beyond the crisis. What does this leader look like? And what is it that makes him fundamentally different from the board of directors that we're used to?
A conscious corporate leader must be aware that he, she, individually, and they, the board, collectively, is the conscience of the company. Because the company is an artificial person without a heart, without a mind, without a soul, and without a conscience. People, when something goes wrong, society's wrath is turned against the company. But the company is an innocent, incapacitated person. The same as a child, unfortunately injured in a motor car accident, a 10-year-old child becomes incapacitated of mind. When something goes wrong, he's innocent. He's got no capacity to make a decision. The company has no capacity. Directors have to be the conscience of the company. Therefore, they have to be conscious corporate leaders to make sure they make decisions in the best long-term health of the company. Because if they get that right, it's for the long-term benefit of all the stakeholders. But if they start acting in self-interest, greed, they start acting for the benefit of one stakeholder, shareholders, for example, you get an imbalance in the whole value creation process. And therefore, conscious corporate leaders want to understand they're acting for an incapacitated person, which has become I think the most critical person in society today is the limited liability company, because that's the source of creating jobs and building the economy. Therefore, you've got to have conscious corporate leaders that understand it's not an intelligence quotient only. You need an emotional quotient and you need a spiritual quotient. By spiritual, I don't mean religion. I mean doing the right thing to create value for society. That's why the company was created in the middle of the 19th century. It was created by society for society. Today we say society is the licensor of the company, but it was actually created by the government of the day, the representative of society, to raise capital, but those who provided the capital had limited liability. And the concomitant of it, when it goes into bankruptcy, if and when, they stand at the back of that queue. But they're no longer liable for the claims of creditors and the employees, which was while wealthy families stopped giving money to unlimited liability organizations.
So, Prof, let me just come in here with maybe a different take on what you've shared with us around the conscious corporate leader. Would you agree with me that we've come to a time where we've had to democratize leadership, whether it's conscious corporate leadership within organizations, and not leave it up to the board to model the leadership that we want to be, and make conscious corporate leadership the norm throughout the organization? Could it be that we've kept directors and the board somewhat separate on a pedestal within an organization, and that hasn't served us? And what we need is a democratized leadership, and perhaps a democratized conscious leadership throughout the organization.
Well, what I believe, there are three tiers in a company. There's the tone at the top, the tune in the middle, and the feet at the bottom. There's always those people in the company. And my experience tells me that one has to get your business model and your strategic direction accepted by every level in the company. And this is where you've got to walk the talk. This is not just sitting there as a leader and deciding things as a thinking body, which the board is, but actually through its management and led by the chief executive, you get buy-in into that business model. If you get buy-in from the top to the bottom, you start, to use your word, democratizing
Yeah.
that strategy, and everybody feels they're participating in it, and they're playing their part in achieving that ultimate goal, that strategy. And so from the chairman down to the tea lady, they are playing their part. And when you get that belief in the company, you get pride in working for the company. Morale improves, and you have less corruption. Because I'm very proud to work for King Limited, whatever the name of the company is. I work for King Limited. It's a question of pride. Here, watch it here. You just have less corruption. But the important thing is, when you get that, you can get ordinary people to achieve the most extraordinary things. I've been there, I've done it. If you don't get that right, you can have PhDs from the top down to the tea lady. You won't even achieve ordinary things.
Sure. So beautiful insights there around how to move people and achieve extraordinary things. I do want to come back to another idea that you raised in one of your responses, Prof, that really intrigued me. You spoke about this idea of chief value officers. What is that role essentially, and what makes it different from chief financial officers that we have become accustomed to?
Well, accountants study accountancy, and they get their CA, and they go into companies. And until it turned into the 21st century, they were known as bean counters, in inverted commas. And they applied the principles of double entry bookkeeping system, which was invented in the 15th century in Italy, in Venice. And essentially, that's the foundation of accountancy to this very day. Of course, there's been huge modification to matters like revenue recognition, etc. But today, in this value creation process, integrated thinking, the chief financial officer, through his training, a public interest training, which accountants do get, he is the true change maker in the C-suite. So I've been to many C-suites as an advisor, and I see when the CEO, the COO, whoever it is, the CIO, and then the CFO comes along, he's the one that really understands this thinking, this integrated thinking, and that you've got these resources with the relationships of stakeholders, which are all inextricably intertwined. And the more you integrate them, the better it is for the company, and the company operates more efficiently. So he's really dealing with all these values. So he's rather should be called a chief value officer than a chief financial officer. And I'm delighted to say that the International Federation of Accountants in November 2019, which is a few months ago, issued a statement saying Professor King is correct. We are going to try and persuade all our members, which includes the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants, to make sure that their CAs become known as CVOs and chief value officers. And we should advocate an integrated value creation system for all businesses at the international financial accounting level. So I was delighted when they accepted that, and I wrote a book about it, which was published in about 2016. It's been translated into Japanese and other languages. And this concept is catching on around the world, that really an accountant today, it's a misnomer to call him or her a chief financial officer. Of course, they don't deal only with financial matters.
Yeah.
So if you take a large company like Coca-Cola, the question of conservation of water is no longer a CSR matter. It's built into the very strategic direction of the company. And who's got to deal with that? The CFO. But it's got nothing to do with financial, but it has huge financial outcomes. And so he's a value officer.
Fantastic, and it's going to be interesting to see how that translates into not only the South African market, but worldwide. As you've said, the book has already been translated in multiple languages. Final question for you, Prof, is I want to borrow the concept of value and pose a different question and say, how, given the efforts of rebuilding and resurrecting the South African economy, how might boards add the most value to those resurrection efforts and to that rebuilding? What is the priorities that you think, if boards just got this right during this time of crisis, the impact that this is going to have in this re-strengthening, rebuilding, and resurrecting the South African economy is going to be positive. Top 3 priorities focusing on.
Well, the board has to have this mindset of an integrated, collaborative, compromising mindset, because you have to compromise between the company and stakeholders, and the stakeholders inter se have to compromise. But the critical thing is to make sure that it is seen that the company is creating value for society, not just making a bottom line monetary profit at any cost, is actually creating value for society, which has been so hard hit during Coronanomics. And today, the shareholder activist is going to, before Coronanomics, but even more so now with Coronanomics, the shareholder activist is taking a backseat to civil society activism. Civil society activism is a greater threat to a company acting improperly than shareholder activism. So civil society is going to take a greater and greater role to see how companies are operating. So boards, that collective mind of the board has just got to become more aware. If what we are doing, is it acceptable to the community in which I'm operating? Do I continue to have the trust and confidence of the community in which I'm operating in the company, of which I am the guardian, I am the conscience of the company? Do I have that? If you don't achieve that during this period of survival and moving into a thriving mode, then I believe you're not a conscious corporate leader.
Prof, thank you very, very much. I think you've left us with so much to think about. Big questions about how do we show up in leadership positions that we occupy on boards. Are we embodying conscious corporate leadership? Is our posture one of collaboration and integration and compromise? Because if it isn't, it means that we're not doing justice to the communities within which we operate. A very big thank you to Professor Mervyn King for giving us time in his diary for this conversation. Remember, we'd love to have your feedback, your comments, your thoughts on what you've just heard. You can comment on our LinkedIn pages as well as on this YouTube channel that you're watching the video on. And of course, we'd love to see your contributions on our social media pages, and all the handles are below. For myself, Nozipho Shabalala, this has been another crucial conversation for Critical Moments. Thank you for joining us on Campus Connect.